Good morning. Thank you all for being here. This morning we will look at Luke chapter 15. If you would, go ahead and turn there. We'll be there for almost all of the morning. And I cut out about half of what I had looked at for this. There's so much information here. It's so rich. And to get you out of here before the sun goes down, I had to cut a lot out. There's more in your handout than I will actually speak on. And this morning we're going to look at the parable of the lost things, specifically the people who are rejoicing. This year we're looking at being a family, about our fellowship, and what we're going to look at in these parables specifically is those who come to rejoice when the thing is found. That's who we are. We're supposed to be rejoicing whenever the lost is found. Now, absolutely, we play parts, and some of these roles are specific to us, but our focus today will be that of those who are rejoicing. So, there are three stories, but there's really kind of one parable. There's one root to the parable, and there's three branches that it takes. And so you see that the first two are connected in verse 8 by the word or. And then when you get to the third, it says, and he said, to make a conjoining of the first two and the third, because the third one is different, but it's still from that same root. You see in verses 6 and 7, verses 9 and 10, and verses 22 to 24, the rejoicing over the finding of the lost sheep, the finding of the lost coin, and the finding of the lost child. Now, it's the parable of the prodigal son. Yes, absolutely. But if you keep it in context with the other two, it's the lost child. He's the one who went out and he was lost, and then he found himself. He came to himself and was rejoined. There are some similarities in all of these objects. First is that the object is always of value. The sheep is of value. There's not enough sheep there for it to be butchered at mass. There's only 100 of them, and yet every single one has value. The coin itself represents a day's wage lost out of a paycheck, and then the lost child. All children matter, no matter how many you have. And this individual has two. There's not an overabundance. There's an heir and a spare, and here the spare is lost. While there is sustenance there, 100 sheep is a lot of sheep. That'll make a lot of milk. That'll make a lot of wool for garments. 2 children is wonderful. Many children, or a larger family, is considered a larger abundance or a greater blessing from the Lord, the more that you have. So there's sustenance here, but there's not overabundance. Yet there's also prosperity. The idea of prosperity. You have 100 sheep. That's a lot. That should take care of a family. There is 10 of these coins. Each coin is the equivalent of a day's wage. So if there's 10 coins there, that's 5 working days and 5 working days. That's a 2 weeks paycheck. There's a job that you have, and yet every single day, that paycheck, it's worth something. And if you do have 2 children, then again, as it has been called in times of old, there's the heir and a spare. You have benefit of being prosperous, this idea of sufficiency, and yet there is value. And so we get to our first extra point of the morning. Your efforts can be valuable without being the fullness of the heavenly reward. What does that mean? Our worship here together today is valuable, and yet it's nothing compared to what loved ones past are enjoying around the throne. It is nothing in comparison to what we will do in heaven the singing that we will have there, the praise that we will be able to offer before God. This is nothing in comparison to that, and yet it is sufficient. It is sustaining. It is of benefit to us. It's valuable. It's very valuable that we are able to benefit from one another, that we are able to proclaim salvation throughout this community and throughout this world. It's a little piece of the great thing. It's valuable. Those who should be there are called. And this is where we start to begin to turn a little bit. Look at verse 6. We'll read that. Luke 15, verse 6. And when he comes home, this is after he's found the sheep, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." For the coin, we'll look at verse 9, after she sweeps the house and finds it. Verse 9, and when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, I have found the coin that was lost." And after the prodigal son comes to himself and comes home, let's read verse 22. But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet." So in that welcoming home, the servants are called upon to gather in, to be part of the festivities, to enjoy the salvation, the return of the object to its proper place. They're called on to enjoy that with the one who has been saved, the one who has been found, that thing of value that has been returned to where it ought to be. The friends and neighbors and slaves in the last one, they're different. And this is a large section that I have cut out. They're different. And yet in the story, they're also the same. They're not the one who has been saved. They are the ones who are called to rejoice in what has been saved. Well, what about the older son? We'll talk about him in a few moments. And whether or not these are all the same kinds of people. But here in all three of these versions of this parable, they called on to rejoice. When salvation has been found, we rejoice. When someone is saved, we rejoice. The angels in heaven rejoice. We read that here. And yet we're told to do the same thing. That whenever we see a soul that would have been condemned to the eternal fires of hell, being saved for all eternity and having come to a right relationship with God, we are to rejoice. That's what we are called on to do. In these stories, we are told the same story, and we are supposed to be a part of that. In Jesus' response to the Pharisees, he says in verse 4, "What man of you?" You're supposed to put yourself in the place of this story. What man of you, you having lost a sheep? And then later in verse 8, he says, "Or what woman?" So what woman among you having lost a coin? You're supposed to put yourself there in that place. You are the protagonist of the story. You are the one who is to seek, to go out and find, to look for. But in verse 11, we see a different opening to the message. There was a man who had 2 sons. This story is about God. This story is about how God will receive the thing that has been lost. It's not quite the same. God desires for all of his children to return. So we get to extra point number 2. God looks for all people to be his people. He looks for all people to come to him. Any who will be willing to come to him humbly, he will be willing to accept. And yet, if you choose not to be part of his family, not to be part of the saints, not to be those who rely on him every day for the things that they have, those who turn away from salvation, we also see that God is willing to respect those wishes, even to your own destruction. If you want to die, he'll let you, because he will respect that decision. But if you want to come to him, he will save you. because he loves you and wants you to be with him. He wants the object of value to be where it ought to be, with the one who determines and gives that object its value. In the last story, in these stories, there's a difference in self-awareness. In the first two, the sheep and the coin, the sinner lacks self-awareness. So we see a sheep who needs a leader. It needs someone to take care of it. It needs a flock. It needs a family. It's lost. It's by itself. It has no conscientious sentience that it could find itself. The coin, obviously, it can't find itself. It can't move itself to where it ought to be. And so we have our work cut out for us. Go get them. Go find them. They need you. People don't know how lost they are. And that's our job, to be the light that is not hidden under a basket, but shines brightly for all to see. The word in the world, this is what we are to be. Go find them. Bring them home. Work diligently to get them. As we see diligent work in the sweeping of the house, as we see diligent work in the man who goes throughout the barren place or the desert or the wilderness, depending on your translation. He goes to find them. A man and a woman is used. This is each one of our responsibilities. So circle back to our extra point number 1. Our efforts are valuable. Our efforts are worthwhile. Our efforts have meaning. What you do matters, and your seeking the lost matters. Your not seeking the lost matters as well. We'll look at that later. Ultimately, sinners must come to themselves and humbly return to God. Let's look at verse 19. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Verse 21. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Ultimately, sinners must come to themselves and humbly return to God, which is back to extra point number 2. God is always willing to receive those who will come to him to be saved. Will you come to him to be saved? Will you look to God for your salvation? Will you seek his face, realizing that without him, you're lost, you're lonely, your value cannot be used? In the story, you see the response of the Father. He assures us that he will bless them and forgive them and honor them, that he is going to kill the fatted calf. He's going to put the robe on them that says, this is my child. He's going to put the signet ring on the finger that says, you belong to this family. He says, you need to be here. And it's not just that, well, I'll deal with you. And it's not just that, well, I'll put up with you, or I'll let you sleep out in the barn. It's here. I have a place for you. I have prepared a room for you. And so that we find points to another statement that Jesus has made, that he has gone to prepare us a place in his Father's house so that we would be welcomed when we come. We would be welcomed as those who are members of his family. God assures us, the Father assures us, we have a place in his family. Number 2, verse 4. Let's read verse 4. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Verse 8, what woman of you, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? Verse 20, and he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. God will find you if you want him to. If you want to be part of his family, if you want to be saved, if you want to go to heaven, to that home that is prepared, God will find you. And God will take you home. And God will love you forever. For the one who wants to be found. We read of a problem, though, a little sticky point that we find at the very end of the third version of this parable that you find in verse 28 with the older brother, the one who was already there, the one who belonged in his father's house and yet had a little bit of an issue with the sinner who came home. In verse 28 we read, "But he was angry," that is the older brother, "and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him." So his father comes out to talk to him about, well, why aren't you going in? Why aren't you rejoicing? What is your problem with your brother who has come to salvation? And so that's where we return to the original focus of our lesson. Your paper says friends, neighbors, and slaves, or sons and slaves. In your paper later on, it'll just be the initials FNSS, so that I could save space. And so you find the friends, the neighbors, as they are in the first two parables, the slaves or servants that you read of in the third version of the parable, and you have this older son, and all of them are called on to do the same thing. They're all called on to rejoice, whether it's the older brother. The father says, why aren't you rejoicing? You should be rejoicing. Your brother has come home. The servants, they're told, get this feast ready. Get this massive celebration going. Let's get this thing going. And with the first two, you see that they call the friends and the neighbors. Well, who is a neighbor? I refer you to a different parable, that of the Good Samaritan. Who is a friend? Shouldn't we all be friends? And so whether you would consider yourself the closest of friends, the closest of neighbors, someone else's servant, or someone else's brother, at the very minimum, you would have to call others who are saved brother. And in verse 32 we see, it is fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. There is no reason whatsoever that we should not rejoice over each other as brethren. There's no reason that we should have to lack fellowship with one another. Now, I'll pause right here and say that it may not be safe for us to show our affection. It may not be safe for us to gather at a feast. This morning, I'm not feeling well. I've distanced myself from all of the other men who have been a part of the worship service this morning. I'm not even in the little room. That's why you can't see me in the window. I'm trying to hide whatever sickness I might have, whether I do or not, from anyone else because I value them and I value you. Also, what's awesome is the men who step up and do things anytime they are asked, and I thank you for doing that. We're called on to rejoice any way that we can, any word of kindness that we could offer. Verse 6, rejoice with me. Verse 9, rejoice with me. Verse 23, make the preparations. Verse 24, for this my son was dead and he is alive again. Let's celebrate that. People can be saved. All three lessons are calling for rejoicing on our part anytime someone comes to the truth. All three parables start because Jesus is receiving sinners. Now, you can't find cleansing if you're already clean. And so Jesus isn't calling those who are already righteous to be more righteous. He's calling the defiled. He's calling the people who use four-letter words on the regular. He's calling the people who are fornicating. He's calling the people who are homosexuals. He's calling whoever it is that's breaking his laws. And he's saying to them, you are currently dead. What you are is lost. You are not of value. You cannot be used purposefully. but you can be made alive. You can be living. You can be found. You have a proper place, and that is with God. You have a way that you can be valuable. All three parables start because verse 1, Jesus is receiving sinners, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and he eats with them." He's dealing with gross folks. They don't know how to worship properly. They don't know how to keep our rules. They don't know which pew to sit in. They don't know which translation to read. They don't know how to pray the right way. They use the wrong words. They're not like us. They're gross. You shouldn't be dealing with them. And so by the end of the parable, the third version of the parable, Jesus is rebuking them, calling them the older brother, saying that you have what you are supposed to be doing. You have the blessings of being a member of this family. Share them. There's no less for you because there's more for someone else. There is more for us all, and additional reason to be rejoicing in the salvation of your brothers and sisters. Rejoice like they do in heaven. Verse 7, just so I tell you that there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than over the 99 righteous persons who have no need of repentance. Verse 10, just so I tell you there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And when you get to the end of the third story, it's, but you keep getting stuck on these temporal things. You keep getting stuck on the fact that they're sinners. You're a sinner too. But those who come to God humbly, they receive the blessing of the family. Pharisees and scribes are called grumblers here. They grumbled at him in verse 2. Jesus is receiving sinners. He's receiving not the right kind of people. And so when he rebukes them, calling them the older brother at the end of the third version of this story, you see that he's saying you are exalting yourself beyond what you ought to be exalting yourself, which is a major theme of the book of James. We'll be getting there in a couple of months to do our study on Wednesday night. And this is one of the major themes that you find throughout the book of James. I will very loosely paraphrase James chapter 1 and verse 10 in saying the haves should consider themselves no better than the have-nots because they will all die. We will all stand before God. The haves and the have-nots, we will all stand before God. God's going to rejoice over those who have come to him in faith, who have come to him humbly. He's going to rejoice with those who are already rejoicing because of the salvation that has been accepted by so many. And the Pharisees, the grumblers, are warned. The little arguments that you want to have, the bickering among the bickering about the acceptance of salvation by a different kind of, the not right people, by the sinners, that's not going to cut it. The friends, the neighbors, the slaves, the older sons, they only exist in these parables to tell us how we should react to seeing the saving grace of God go out. Does everybody have it just right? Well, I'll ask, do you? Are we haughty enough? Are we bold enough? Are we prideful enough to say that we can't be wrong? And yet every seed is called upon to grow. And while some of you have been bearing fruit for years and years and years, the end of this third parable reminds us some seeds are just starting to grow. And watching them grow is a blessing all on its own. Watching them grow should be something that we celebrate. Are they going to make mistakes? Yeah. See, we use words like, are they going to make mistakes? Yeah. And we say, but we'll help them. The difference is those mistakes are not, tripping or falling. Those mistakes are not whether they stand up to pray or they sit to pray. Those mistakes are whether or not they commit adultery. Those mistakes are whether or not they show up here so hungover they can't see. Those mistakes are going to rehab. Those mistakes are, I have deadly sin in my life and I need it fixed. Are we ready to help them with that? Are we ready to help our brothers and sisters with real sin and not just, I forgot to read my Bible today? While sin separates us from God, and I'm not trying to say that there are different levels of sin, I will say that it's easy for us to find some sins more difficult to overlook, to forgive, to talk to someone about than others. The friends, the neighbors, the servants, and the sons in these parables exist to show us that when people come humbly to God, we should have a proper reaction of celebration. Isaiah prophesies of Jesus' salvation being offered in Isaiah 25, verses 8 and 9. And in that salvation that is offered, we see proper reaction. What God's children will do in reaction to that salvation being offered. Verse 8, He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of His people He will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. Verse 9, and it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We've waited for Him that He might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for Him. Let us be glad and rejoice in His salvation. What is the definition of the gospel? 2 words. Good news. Rejoice at the gospel, the good news. Do you want a feast to celebrate, to rejoice in? Then go check the mountains. Go sweep the house. Go find the sinner and show him the way home. Let him know that there is a Father who is waiting to receive him, to fall on his neck and kiss him, to kill the fatted calf, to bring the robe and put it on him, and to slide that signet of a member of the family, that ring, onto his finger. There is a God who wants to save the sinner. Let's find good reasons to rejoice. Who is that? Luke 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with him. That's why he tells them this parable. Verse 3 actually says, so he told them this parable. That's the purpose of this lesson. Go find the sinners and help them find their way home. Bring them to God. And they don't have to know what church is like. And they don't have to have the right idea of what we do here on Sunday. And it doesn't have to be normal church. It can be this parking lot. Because none of that's the point. The point is, Father, I have sinned against heaven and have sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And the subsequent celebration that will follow, because our fatted calf has already been prepared. Our lamb has already been slain. The celebration is standing by, waiting for any sinner to come home. If you're lost, if you're out on that mountain, if you're tucked up underneath the cupboard, if you're eating the food that's not even fit for people and indulging in sin that only animals should partake in, there's a Father waiting to save you. There is a Savior that has already died for you. There is salvation available, free of charge, for those who will come and seek His face. If you need the assistance of the Father today, make it known before you leave this place.